Good evening, everyone, and thank you again to the Society for the opportunity and to come to talk about my most recent work, which has been on 1641 and County Louth. I suppose to begin, really, the genesis of my research in this area is because I was part of a team back in the late 2000s, late 2010s, who were working on a project to publish the depositions online. And that was a project that began back in 2007 when a team of researchers from Trinity College Dublin, the University of Aberdeen, and the University of Cambridge embarked on a project which was multifaceted to conserve, digitize, transcribe, and then make available online the 1641 depositions. The project at the time was funded by the Irish Research Council, the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK, and the Library of Trinity College Dublin. And it became very much a groundbreaking digital humanities project at that time, making what was a very controversial but very inaccessible resource available to scholars across the world for the first time in over 350 years. We had a very sort of auspicious launch when we, in 2010, launched to great aplomb with 19,000 pages and 31 volumes going online. And we had over 70,000 users within the first few days. And it was launched in the Long Room in Trinity by both then President Mary McAleese and Dr. Ian Paisley, Lord Bandside, who came together at that time for the night. And since its launch, it has continued to garner interest with lots of academic researchers, as well as family researchers, very much beginning to access it and publish their material and the output of their research over the last decade. What we've seen is that very many of the people who are using it continue to be family researchers from across Ireland and indeed across the world, many of them the descendants of the English and Scottish settlers who arrived in Ireland during the plantations, and many of them again also the descendants of some of those who were actually named as Gaelic rebels in those depositions. So the purpose of my paper today is to introduce you a little bit to those 1641 depositions, but in particular then to take us into County Louth. I'm going to begin by giving a brief overview of the outbreak of the rebellion before introducing what the depositions themselves, and then introducing the depositions for Louth, analysing, for example, how they produce evidence of areas like robbery, murder, and military action in the county. So on the 22nd of October, 1641, authorities foiled a plot to seize Dublin Castle when an intoxicated Owen Connolly revealed the scheme to Sir William Parsons. Many of the leaders of the plot, including men like Hugh McMahon and Conor Lord Maguire, were captured the following morning. But news of the rebellion at that time, of course, didn't travel fast, so that the centrepiece of the rebellion, while it had fallen apart in Dublin, rebels in Ulster, led by Sir Phelim O'Neill in particular, began to seize key locations, including Charlemont Fort and indeed Newry, both not too far from here. Yet what had begun as a relatively structured attempt to seize control of the country and many of the country's strongholds at the time quickly descended into what became a nationwide rebellion, where many Gaelic Irish rose in that rebellion, quite often against their own neighbours. The rebellion spread into County Louth very, very quickly as Northern Leinster and Connacht in particular basically fell into rebellion within the opening days. And by the spring of 1642, most of the country had in some way been affected. Government forces, however, continued to retain control of a number of key towns and fortifications, particularly those along the coast, which included, of course, Drogheda, but also areas like Dublin, Carrickfergus, Londonderry, Cork City, Youghal, and Kinsale. As the rebellion spread, however, more and more displaced Protestants fled from their homes to areas of security, including those Irish towns and fortified sites, chief amongst them being Dublin. And from Ulster in particular, where the rebellion started, many settlers fled straight down to Dublin, while others appear to have taken coastal routes and gone back by boat to areas in Scotland and in England. But as the reports of devastation began to spread, the Lords Justices in Ireland took note and established a commission of 7 clergymen to, as Aidan Clark has noted, very much collect information about certain aspects of the rebellion in Ireland. That information was collected in a series of examinations, or what became known as depositions, taken from displaced Protestant settlers, with the commission receiving orders to examine under oath, and I quote, "what robberies and spoils have been committed upon them on the 22nd, since October the 22nd last, or shall hereafter be committed upon them, what their names are, or where they now or last dwelt that committed those robberies, and on what day or the night the said robberies or spoils were committed, or to be committed were done." They were also asked about discovering traitorous or disloyal words, speeches, or actions that were being uttered by rebels. And indeed, as time went on, the body of evidence was expanded to include areas like apostasy or forced conversion of religion. So quite a large amount of information was requested. That in turn was expanded by a catch-all at the end, which asked people to report any other information they had, which quite often not only gave details of further robberies, but then also gave evidence of other crimes like murder. The body of evidence that was then collected became known as the 1641 depositions. And the depositions are really those witness testimonies by the mainly Scottish and English Protestants concerning their experiences during that 1641 rebellion. The testimonies that they gave, as the commission describes, documented losses of goods and chattels. That's probably the bulk of the information. And if you open them up and you read them online, you'll read a lot about cows and sheep and the different everyday aspects of life that were robbed from people. You'll read about military activity. It could be rebels coming into a town. It could be rebels attacking an area. And then you'll read about this huge range of alleged crimes by mainly Gaelic Irish rebels, including areas like assault, imprisonment, the stripping of clothes, murder, and indeed some massacres. This body of evidence is unparalleled elsewhere in early modern Europe. It's completely unique. And so for Irish historians, we have an opportunity to look at this source to really understand a wide area of our history in the 17th century, so that it's a body of evidence that allows us to look at the social, economic, cultural, religious and political history of Ireland, England and Scotland in the 1640s. The depositions themselves have long been very controversial because they constitute what is the chief evidence for the shared, the allegation, the sharply contested allegation that the rebellion really began with a general massacre of Protestant settlers in Ireland. So why were they collected? Well, they weren't collected to provide us with historical narrative, but they were collected to provide us with evidence as a means to potentially provide compensation for the losses to the settlers, and to then in turn prosecute the rebels who were implicated within them. So that we know, for example, the statements are very legalistic in style. They begin with the name of the deponent and their address, making them useful as legal documents, but obviously in the modern day, useful as genealogical documents as well. And as befits the original remit of the commission, they are a wealth of information about what happened. The depositions themselves were given to Trinity College in Dublin in 1741, at the time to mark the 100th anniversary of the rebellion. But due to their fragility, they remained relatively poorly investigated by historians until recent years. The only way you could access them, for example, was on microfilm, and that microfilm was black along both edges, as were many microfilms which were taken in the sort of 1960s in general. Assumptions, therefore, were always made about their content, specifically that concept that the rebellion began with a general massacre of Protestant settlers. And that concept was very much predicated on the depositions that had appeared in print in England in the immediate aftermath of their collection. So that almost immediately as they were being collected, these documents were being published to give an insight into what was happening in Ireland. And you can imagine that obviously a bit like our newspapers today, they wanted to highlight the actual, sort of really glossy bits and real highlights of trauma that were happening. So that the originals that you can see here, for example, were turned into print volumes that looked a little bit like this. And in them, those contemporary publications like Sir John Temple's The Irish Rebellion and Henry Jones' Remonstrance of diverse remarkable passages, they really highlighted some of the more salacious detail of the depositions. And they began to be published from 1642, so very, very early on. In turn, we also had the publication of woodcuts like those in the Tears of Ireland, which were attempting to explain the course of a rebellion using the depositions alongside these illustrative woodcuts, which, as you can imagine, often incited further horror on publication. So, for example, you can see here just one example of where they talk, the depositions are used to talk about crimes against young babies and children. More recently, lots of other historians like Mary Hickson in the 19th century continued to publish these and continue to publish testimonies, often again preferring to reproduce those with the most horrific stories of atrocity and murders, so that the depositions themselves retained almost this mythical sort of, I suppose, idea and particular resonance throughout the 20th century, with a lot of atrocity narratives still being those that people had heard about, and with many of them fueling folk memory, particularly in Ulster, where, for example, Orange Order banners to the modern day depict images of events that are described in the depositions. This is just one that I took not that long ago up in County Armagh, where the Orange Order banner, for example, for one of the lodges in Portadown, shows what is the drowning of Protestants in the River Bann in 1641. And this particular narrative was accounted a number of times in the depositions. So this has huge folk memory implications in Ireland, and is remembered very much culturally on the island. But in the 20th and 21st centuries, of course, the work of other historians like Aidan Clark and Nicholas Canny has become quite seminal in widening our understanding of the source itself and the information within it, so that no more are we just hearing narratives of atrocity, but people are using these to understand a little bit more about the events of the 1640s in Ireland and to understand more about settler communities in Ireland at the time. So now that the material as well has gone online, numerous historians have focused in on the evidence of the depositions to try to understand more about the events in the rebellion, and therefore to discuss some of the contested allegations within them. And what's quite interesting when you look at them as a whole is that these kind of ideas of atrocity, which permeate so much of the early publications around them, are actually quite few in number, so across the board. So when we think about the depositions collection, it covers the whole of Ireland. So depositions were given by settlers all over the country, but there is disparity in terms of their geographical spread. The collection that's now in Trinity contains 31 volumes, which were grouped together in the 18th century by librarians who received them after they were given to the library. And they were grouped not on the basis of story, but on the basis of the county of residence of the deponent. So you can see here in the map of Ireland that there were depositions from right across the country. The vast majority of information that was published in the earliest stages came from Ulster, but Ulster in itself was actually only bound into 8 volumes. Leinster has 11 volumes. We have 10 from Munster, and we have 2 from Connacht. There are 7 volumes alone for County Cork, which is interesting in itself, and it tells us a little bit about the breakdown of the commission at the time. These weren't taken. We have an original Dublin commission where most of the original depositions were collected in between about 1641 and 1647. But we also have copies of material, which we refer to as the wearing copies, We also have material that was taken under a specific commission to Archdeacon Bice down in Munster, because very little information emerged about Munster in the earliest collection of depositions. So that's why we have 7 Cork volumes. And then in turn, we also have miscellaneous material throughout the 1640s and a collection of material from the 1650s, commonly referred to as the Commonwealth Depositions, because it relates to information that was taken during the period of Cromwell in Ireland in particular, when rebels began to be prosecuted for what had happened. What's interesting is that, as I said, the bulk of the work to date has focused on Ulster, and it still does continue to be so. But for example, when we look at it, even within Ulster, the spread of information that we have surviving is very small. I'm from Donegal originally, so my great interest when we started the project was to find out more about what happens in Donegal. Yet Donegal is in the same volume as Derry and Tyrone, and from memory, I think accounts for all of 20 depositions. Yet there are 2 volumes of Cavan material. Further south, we know Dublin has 2 volumes, but yet again, other areas like Leitrim, Sligo and Mayo are in 1 volume. County Louth, however, is in a volume in TCD MS 834, which is together with the Monaghan depositions. And the Louth depositions in particular, again, have been published a number of times. One of the earliest projects we did in the Depositions project was to actually look at some of the early publications, and we looked at the County Louth depositions, which were published in the Journal of the Society back in the 19th century. Interestingly, they also were of great note in our office because one of the researchers, Elaine Murphy, is from Dundalk, and one of our colleagues at the time, Eamon Darcy, is from Drogheda. So there was quite a Louth contingent of people working in this project. There are 33 items in the actual Louth volume itself. And surprisingly, given Louth's central position in much of the early days and in the early months of the rebellion, few of those are actually Dublin originals. There are only 18 Dublin originals, with the earliest being noted by Aidan Clark as the 5th of January 1642, and the latest being the 30th of September 1647. And one of the 18 is actually a misplaced deposition from County Cork. The volume also includes 5 examinations and 10 items from the Commonwealth period. In his introduction to the printed Louth volume, Aidan Clark noted that there is an absence of wearing copies, so copies that were taken immediately for publication as they were being collected. But there are annotations on them to suggest that they were actually copied at the time. Where they've ended up, we're not entirely sure. We can only assume that they must have been lost, but who knows, they may yet appear somewhere in an Irish archive. But despite that paltry number of documents for Louth, we do have Louth material appearing, particularly in the Armagh volume, relating to John Babe, against whom accusations were made of rebel activity in Carlingford. And then there are some further materials scattered throughout the Dublin volumes in particular, as people left County Louth and moved to Dublin. And references to Louth, particularly the Siege of Drogheda, are found across the whole country. So what we can tell on a very cursory look is that Louth, in amongst all of these volumes, is found in one of the smallest volumes for the whole country. Yet it is very rich in information, particularly about everything to do with British society at the time. So in terms of County Louth, you can see that there is a spread of material for most of the county itself. You can see, for example, that there is some clustering, particularly in the Dundalk area for depositions, and then some around the RD area, and then that there is information coming from multiple other parts of the county. We know that of those who were particularly asked about John Babe, that most of those deponents which are found in the Armagh volume, all of them gave their address also as being in the Dundalk area. So Dundalk features quite strongly in those depositions. And there's further evidence to suggest that more and more settlers continue to flow into Louth throughout the rebellion, particularly with deponents in the Armagh volume, noting their Louth addresses, having previously been resident in Armagh prior to the outbreak of rebellion, so that there is a sort of movement of people around this general area. An analysis of the information also allows us to look a little bit at things like gender and occupations in Louth at the time. Of the 33 depositions, 8 were given by women, although 2 of them were actually from County Monaghan, but deposing about things that happened more or less on the borders with Louth. Of the 6 women from Louth, 4 identified themselves as widows and 2 as wives. So of those widows, obviously many of them may have lost their husbands during the course of the rebellion. Of the 25 documents in the volume attributed to men, 14 included references to their occupations, and they included gentlemen, rectors, clerks and vicars, esquires, innkeepers and a shoemaker. And similarly, in the Armagh volume, we can actually find quite a number of the men having military positions, including a soldier, lieutenant and a captain. So a great range of occupations appearing right across County Louth at the time. Given then the small collection of depositions for Louth, it's actually quite difficult to do a detailed analysis of the county in that time. The rebellious activity that comes out from it is probably less rich material than other locations across Ireland. But what we do find in the Louth volumes, which is really rich, is information on, for example, the Old English and the rebellion and their entry into the rebellion. We know a lot about losses, about murder, about stripping, about rebellious words and about military action. And that is very, very rich across the board. We know that obviously a lot of it is concentrated in the northern part of the county with less information coming out for the south of the county. And of course, that's likely due to the fact that Drogheda itself holds out in government hands throughout much of the rebellion, and therefore people in the town wouldn't necessarily have given statements in the same way. But when we look at the depositions themselves, we can find out an awful lot about the gentry of County Louth in particular. And I'm always very interested in finding out a little bit more about them because of the fact that they are obviously central to the continuation of the rebellion as time progresses. In its very earliest stages, of course, a lot of it is fueled by rebels who are sort of, masterless men across the country, as they've been described by other historians. Whereas by the time it comes to County Louth and into County Meath, we're seeing more and more organisation, particularly amongst the Old English. The original outbreak, of course, came as a surprise to authorities. They weren't expecting it because the country had been in a relative state of peace for almost 3 decades throughout the plantation period. Rebellion had been confined to words. There had been the occasional skirmish. There had been lots of debate in Parliament. But in the 1640s, of course, there were further rumblings of discontent, some of them fueled because of the Old English, particularly due to frustrations with Charles I and his policies in Ireland. And for many of the Old English and as Catholic supporters of Charles in particular, they continued to protest their allegiance to Charles throughout the 1630s and 1640s when he was in crisis in England. Despite orchestrating a rebellion, for example, on the 24th of October, Phelim O'Neill actually issued a proclamation which gives us an indication of what was going through the minds of some of these leaders at the time. And Phelim O'Neill is someone who is mentioned in practically every deposition across the country. And in it he declared, and I quote, "The present proceedings were not in any way directed against the king, nor was it the intention of those in arms to injure any of his subjects, whether Scottish or English. In fact, their aim was to, and I quote, defend their own liberties and the liberties of the natives of the Irish nation." So O'Neill himself continued to profess the rebels' loyalty to the king throughout, going so far as to publish a forged commission for the king for what he was doing on the 4th of November 1641, in which the king reputedly expressed his permission for him and the others to take arms in his defence. Now, O'Neill emerges as the pseudo-leader of the rebellion, as I said, across the country. And with the depositions, we find obviously evidence of that leadership, particularly as his name is mentioned everywhere. But outside of Ulster, the rebellion needed more leaders. And we know that local leadership in particular was important to steer that progress and to ensure some level of orderliness on the ground. So in the face of potential invasion by government armies, the Old English emerged as the key element in the rebellion's future. Given their stronghold in Leinster, it of course then became a focal point of activity from about November 1641. And Nicholas Canny noted, for example, that a lot of the scholarly texts at the time treated Leinster in particular as a bastion of Old English and Catholic interest in Ireland. So it was here and in this region that the Old English community were traditionally entrenched, and the Old English, very much in their earliest guise, emerge as these leaders. But what's interesting is, in the initial planning of the rebellion, they were completely outside of plans for the rebellion, continuing to espouse loyalty to the king. But when the government forces marched across Leinster to Julianstown in County Meath, where they were defeated by rebel forces on the 29th of November 1641, the Old English gentry became acutely aware of the threat to their position. And as Breed McGrath acknowledges in her work, that forced them into a dilemma of whether to join with their co-religionists or to maintain their traditional stance of loyalty. Julianstown, however, became the turning point. Following the government forces' defeat, and in particular following increasing pressure from their co-religionists in the north, the Old English peers and gentry and freeholders and some townsmen came together on the hill of Crofty in Meath in December 1641 and began to debate their position. A similar meeting was held in Tullyesker in Louth, and, for example, depositions began to emerge and letters and so on, accounting for all of the evidence of this. The deponent William Moore, for example, a gentleman who described himself as being from Barmeath, gave a long list of gentry in his deposition, particularly those who attended the meeting at Tullyesker. And he mentions people like Lord Louth, Sir Christopher Bellew and Sir Christopher Barnwell of Rothesker. But he also mentions family names that are familiar to most of us in this region, like Garlands and Tafts and Whites and Plunkets and so on. So many of those families joined in the discussions. Military considerations were high in the agenda, but of course they were particularly, high in the agenda because English authorities were reluctant to provide the gentry of the region with arms for their own protection. And that's believed to have contributed to the decision which they finally made to join in the rebellion. So despite their protests of loyalty, their Catholic religion continued to mean that authorities were concerned about them throughout the early stages of the rebellion, and that contributed to their discontent. So the Old English decided to join in the rebellion, offering more local leadership across the province and, of course, resources to continue to fuel the rebellion, with many of them then in turn becoming more and more involved in the politics of the day, particularly the Confederation in 1642. Other areas, of course, come also to the forefront in the depositions, and the Louth depositions not only point to that sort of a sort of military gathering and leadership, but also to the breakdown of life in County Louth. We know in particular that the region was disrupted heavily by robbery, with robbery being noted by nearly every deponent. And they began to emerge from the very, very earliest days of rebellion. Amy Briscoe, who was a widow from Ardee, noted that she was robbed of goods as early as the 26th of October 1641, mere days into the rebellion. And she lost everything from her house to household goods to corn and to hay, which she valued at £116. And like many others, she also noted losses that were accrued through lands and mortgages and rental incomes that she could no longer collect. And again, some of that was significant income, particularly to women who, many of whom were describing themselves as widows in their depositions. Bristol was interestingly robbed by a rebel called Colum Brian McMahon, who was from Monaghan, and he was described as a colonel of the rebels. And again, she describes how he came with his soldiers and accomplices to rob her. He came, as I said, as a relative near neighbour of hers. She knew who he was, she could tell his name, and she was able to list many of those who were with him. So that tells you a little bit more about how life had begun to break down. Colum Brian McMahon appears to have extensively raided in the Ardee area. He also attacked Dame Jane Moore, for example, and she was incredibly informed also that it was McMahon and other rebels who had robbed her and her daughter of lands, tithes and profits. He plundered the hinterland of Ardee with William Usher, the rector of Killincool, pointing the finger towards him, and to Phelim O'Neill for being responsible for losses which for him included plate, corn in the haggard, corn in the ground, monies, books, linens, household goods, cows, horse, plate, and even his personal apparel and that of his wife. What's interesting about that is, from someone like me who does a lot on social history, it's quite interesting to look at the loss. While it's a list of what we think, okay, he was terribly robbed, it's interesting to note that these people lived very much on the land. So no matter what your role was, you were a rector, you had your own food essentially to supply your household, you had your own animals to supply your household. Deponents also gave evidence of murder in the region. So I've mentioned the concept of the massacre. The massacre didn't really happen as such in County Louth. What we actually saw was an awful lot of individual murders, which were frequently reported by deponents in the area. In County Louth, for example, William Bellis noted how two people, an Edward Washfield and an Alice Holland, were hanged by rebels. Elizabeth Hankin, who was the wife of James, a saddler from Dundalk, noted her husband's murder. And she noted that with the arrival of rebellion in Dundalk, she had fled with her husband to Trim, where, and I quote, her husband was most cruelly put to death, with her father Thomas Pressick and 6 more by one Miles O'Reilly, one Beta the son to Beta of Minulty, and one Plunkett, 3 captains of the rebels and their companies. So the lady alone lost a significant amount of her closest relatives. Another deponent, John Clark, who was a shoemaker from Dundalk, noted the murder of his brother Thomas Clark, who was a yeoman, while he was being held prisoner at Carrickmacross. One of the most gruesome reports, however, from the region was from Thomas McGill, who was the Clerk Vicar of Killarney. And he reported that once he was robbed by the rebels, which included the famous Colum Brian McMahon and others from Monaghan, he was then held in prison with 40 or 50 of his neighbours for about 15 weeks. So you can imagine the hardship of that alone. But then on the 2nd of January of 1642, the rebels put to death the number of 18 persons. He described their deaths, and they were particularly horrible deaths. He testified that they were first stabbed and then hanged, and those that didn't die immediately were stabbed again, following which they were then buried in ditches. The rebels verbally attacked McGill himself, threatening that, and I quote, they had set his parishioners to hell, and shortly they would send that he, this deponent, by burning him with fire. They were threatening me with death for preaching in prison to my flock there. So, terribly gruesome stories, but it reflects that continuing decline in social order as rebellion spread, with rebels often attacking their nearest neighbours, which I think is probably the thing that is most awful about some of the evidence in the depositions, is that it is neighbour on neighbour attack almost. And in this case also, the Reverend McGill suggests that there was religious motivation, particularly with that vengeful attack in a community by Monaghan rebels. Within the County Louth depositions, other aspects come very much to the fore, including military action. And they emerge from the earliest statements, particularly those regarding, as I said, the gatherings of the Gentry in Tully Esker. Within those meetings, for example, we know that many of the men who came forward were then in turn appointed to offices within the military. So that, for example, many of them then were described as the first gentleman of the county, and the likes of Lord Louth was appointed to become a Colonel General of all the forces to be raised in the county of Louth. And it was under their direction in particular that the county then began to organise soldiers for a rebellion. So in this examination, Gerard Colley, for example, stated that an order was issued by the commanders of County Louth amongst the rebels that for every 40 acres within the said county, they should send forth one soldier. So from the earliest days, military action is beginning to mount. And as the rebellion spread and took hold, particularly towns across the county became centres of military action. Of course, Drogheda is probably the most well-known, and it became a centre of rebel military action from about November 1641. It's on the 21st of November that what's now described and referred to as the Siege of Drogheda really begins. The siege, of course, proved a much more protracted affair than many initially assumed it would be. With 20,000 strong forces sent by Phelim O'Neill to attack the town, it might have been presumed that the overthrow of British soldiers in the town would be swift. Drogheda, of course, was under the command of its governor, Sir Henry Tichborne, who held out with just 2,000 forces. An attempt to send a relief force to the town from Dublin, however, was undermined by rebel activities on the 29th of November 1641. And thereafter, attempts to provision the town, to prolong the siege and to retain it in English hands continued to be made by sea. The rebels attempted to thwart every one of those by placing obstacles, such as a bark and then a boom in the path of ships coming up the river. But the efforts continued to fail. And when a storm dislodged the boom in February 1642 and the provision ships began to move up the river, more and more the rebellion was undermined. For example, one of the things that they were able to bring up the river was equipment to cut the makeshift boom. That, coupled with the lack of siege equipment, meant that the rebels struggled to gain control, and their only hope was to starve out the town. But their inability to maintain the blockade meant that the siege was lifted on the 2nd of March 1642. So if you think of the numbers, 20,000 versus 2,000, the odds didn't look great, but the town held out. What's interesting in the Louth volumes is that there are no accounts of the siege of Drogheda. The locals, as I've said, would of course not really have experienced the level of robbery and attack like other parts of the county. So therefore, few of them deposed. But where we can find accounts is by sifting through the other volumes and the wider collection of depositions. While the depositions, of course, are the statements taken at the time, an awful lot of ancillary material is collected, including letters from commissioners who describe events that they're hearing about. And one of those included a letter from Philip Bice to his brother in February 1642. That letter is found in a volume that contains miscellaneous documents associated with the wider work of the Commission, so completely detached from County Louth. And it's there that Bice describes the events in the town in early 1642. And these, for example, included the provisioning of the town along with rebel attacks on the town. He described how on the 12th of January 1642, soldiers in the town were provisioned by Captains Bartlett and Stutfield after a long period under siege. And that night, he notes how the soldiers celebrated and drank freely. In the middle of the night, 500 of the rebels entered the town via a small hole in the wall on the Meath side. And his description continued, noted that given their alcohol consumption, the forces in the town, and I quote, were unfit for defence. That Colonel Tichborne's own letter sets forth that at the time the soldiers were dead with drink and sleep, whom scarcely their own drums nor their enemies' hideous cry could awake. So absolutely out for the count. The colonel himself was fain to go from one court of guard to another and was long before he could get a handful of men to oppose the enemy who were entering the bridge before any opposition. But the work being once begun was soon ended. The slaughter of some set others to their flight through the same hole. They entered, they departed, satisfying the disturbance with the loss of 140 men. Besides, 40 more were taken prisoner, and many ran into the townsmen's houses and hid themselves and were drawn out a week after. Vyse noted that Tichborne declared that throughout the siege he had only lost 12 men, whereas he estimated that the rebels had lost over 1,000. Following the failure of that attack, of course, the town continued under siege for just over a month. And as the siege was nearing an end, some of the vessels that provisioned the town attempted to return again, but fell foul of the tide. The enemy attempted again to use that blunder to their advantage, when Vyse described how, when the enemy about Banktime, being Plunkett of Bewley and others, they gathered into numbers, made towards the vessel, and from the vessel they welcomed them with musket shot, and the contention lasted long shooting. Till at last the enemy, observing that they wanted bulwarks, some brought many cars loading with fires, and in shelter of them drew near, but many of the horse slain. The cars stayed till men drove them forwards, by means whereof great numbers came to the side of the ship, using the shelter of the fires forced. But Captain Stutfield lent them a few patters among the multitudes, which some lost with their feet, wandering till they burst, and destroyed many. Frightened more, some were so bold that they came under the vessel, and with pickaxes were to tear her sides. The soldiers soon leapt out and fought with them and killed them, and returning to their places with their muskets, and some shot a small ordnance, they made great execution. Streams of blood of horses and men were to help her afloat by these means, and God's good pleasure and mercy she escaped them. So a very, very vivid account. So that, to conclude, there can be little doubt in my mind, really, that County Louth, despite the small number of depositions available for it, became a key fulcrum in the 1641 rebellion. Its proximity to Ulster in particular, the Gentry, the strategic towns and ports like Drogheda and Dundalk, and then its location on a direct route to Dublin out of Ulster, made it a theatre of rebellion in the early 1640s. The surviving depositions point to a settler community in Louth that was rich in number, but also enveloped in rebellion almost simultaneously to its outbreak. Louth deponents had every spectrum of an act of rebellion happen to them. I've only mentioned a handful of them this evening, but in the chapter I go into more detail, looking at areas like stripping, for example, and the traitorous words that are made within their statements also. And what's most distressing, I think, about some of these is that the acts were undertaken by near neighbours from adjoining counties in Ulster, men like Colin McBrien and McMahon, who they could name and who they knew, and who then in turn became key actors in the rebellion. What distinguished this rebellion in Louth from other counties, of course, was the role of the Gentry, a role that continued on the rebellion for a number of years, with many of the lords from those strong old English communities coming into the rebellion on the side of the rebels and playing a key role in then orchestrating events in the county and in the years thereafter. Their meeting at Tulliasker, of course, is central in that, particularly as they sought to provision rebel armies at the siege of Drogheda, demanding levies in particular from Protestant settlers within the county to do so. So very much an organisation and a presence. The presence of the key port towns, such as Dundalk and Drogheda, led to more intensive siege activity than many other locations in the early stages of rebellion. Residents at Drogheda must have faced particular hardship. We can get a flavour of it from some of the accounts, but they were effectively cut off from their surrounds for a period of 5 months from November 1641. We can't even really imagine that in the modern world. The coastal location, of course, was important. The presence of the navigable River Boyne enabled the provisioning of the town, but of course in a piecemeal manner. And the town remained under garrison control throughout, but faced the massing of rebels led by Phelim O'Neill on its boundaries. Sporadic attacks led to skirmishes and deaths within the town. And similarly at Dundalk, we see a similar pattern where attacks also were made on the community in the town, and many fled the town almost immediately to avoid assault. So in sum, I would suggest that while the depositions for Louth are small in number, they are quite rich in detail, and I would urge you to go to the website or indeed to the published volume to read them. The information tells us about a breakdown of societal norms as lives become disrupted by the spread of rebellion. And what had been relatively peaceful society comprising Gaelic, Irish, Old English and New English in a county like Louth broke down fairly quickly at the outbreak of rebellion. And I think Louth's even more interesting because we get a real sense of that widening of a community in the county, despite the fact that it's not actually a plantation county. So you can see that there is a real diversity of people living in the county. Deponents give us insights into what was normal practice in society, particularly agriculture, business, money lending, and their family lives. But in their depositions, it becomes evident that life for settlers in the county drastically changed under rebellion, and that, of course, was never really to recover thereafter. So as a result, the depositions themselves are worthy of study, and they're worthy of being put in the context of maybe the wider area of Leinster, but also not just looking at Louth in a vacuum, reading the depositions from across the country that reference what happens here in this region, and indeed particularly those that can be found elsewhere about things like the Siege of Drogheda, which are small in number when it comes to County Louth. So thank you very much.